I'm Julie Hartman. On this Julie Noted, we are discussing why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, it's been over 1 year since that brutal invasion, and nearly every day we are saturated with headlines that broadcast the latest misery and destruction as Americans speculate that Putin must be deranged to seize a country 1/28th the size of Russia. Most Americans don't understand Putin's motives, and they don't see the need to. They know which side is the victim and which the aggressor. Whatever helps Ukraine is right because it undermines Russia. End of story. However, Americans fail to grasp the grave danger of not understanding the adversary's point of view. They disparage such thinking as defeatism, siding with the enemy, or being insufficiently committed to victory. But does examining how a home or business might be vulnerable to burglary mean that the owner wants to be burglarized? Precisely the opposite. Understanding how the situation looks to a would-be offender is not to endorse the offense, but to see how to best decrease vulnerability and harm. 60 years of failed American military interventions, whether it's in Vietnam, Cambodia, Beirut, Somalia, Afghanistan, or Iraq, all began well in the early stages, but then led to a painful, horrifying withdrawal and defeat, largely because we did not understand the people who we were dealing with. Understanding why Putin invaded Ukraine helps us discern how he may behave moving forward and the West's best course of action to stop him. In the movie Rashomon, several witnesses see the same shocking event, but later recall it differently, each of them remembering a version supportive of his or her viewpoint alone. Likewise, Russians and Ukrainians sympathetic to union with Russia see Western intervention very differently than do Ukrainians determined to keep their country free of Russian domination. But knowing why requires a look at the region's history. Ukraine became an independent country for the first time in 1991. But long before that, control of Ukraine passed from one power to another. For centuries, Ukraine was divided between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which controlled the western half, and the Russian Empire, which controlled the eastern half. This split underlies the dividing loyalties in the country's population, why some Ukrainians, mostly in the west of the country, feel European and are hostile to Russia, while many in the eastern part feel kinship with Russia and are suspicious of Europe. During World War I, the two great powers controlling Ukraine, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, were at war with one another. After World War I, both of these empires, as well as the German Empire and Ottoman Empire, collapsed, and national borders had to be created and redrawn. Following the Treaty of Versailles, the region known as Ukraine was divided among 4 different countries. The West became part of the newly independent country of Poland. The East was part of the Soviet Union, which called its part of Ukraine the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, one of the 15 SSRs that comprised the USSR, the reason for the name Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. And smaller sections of Ukraine became parts of Romania and Czechoslovakia. In 1939, as World War II began in Europe, Germany invaded Poland from the west, and the Soviet Union invaded it from the east, and each took half of Poland for themselves. The Soviet Union unified the western part of Ukraine that had been Polish territory since the end of World War I with the eastern part of Ukraine that the Soviet Union already controlled, forming an enlarged Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviet Union inflicted horrific suffering on the Ukrainian SSR, most famously the Holodomor in 1932 and 1933, when Stalin created a man-made famine on the kulaks, or the farmers who opposed collectivization, murdering 4 million Ukrainians. After World War II, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic remained intact, and the part of Ukraine that the Soviet Union took from Poland was never returned. Ukraine remained one of the 15 Soviet Socialist republics within the Soviet Union for the next 46 years. But in August of 1991, as the Soviet Union dissolved, Ukraine finally became an independent nation for the first time in history. More on Ukraine's independence in a moment, but now let's move on to Crimea. A principal dispute between Ukraine and Russia is Crimea, a peninsula that juts southward into the Black Sea. Like Ukraine, Crimea was passed from one power to another, in this case, from Turkey to Russia. For 300 years, Crimea was controlled by the Tatars, an ethnic Turkic group within the Ottoman Empire. But in 1783, Empress Catherine the Great of Russia took Crimea from the Ottoman Empire and made it part of the Russian Empire. That same year, 1783, Russia founded the city of Sevastopol on the Black Sea coast of Crimea. Sevastopol is vital to Russia, then and now, because it has a natural deep water port which can accommodate the largest naval ships. These ships can cross the Black Sea and enter the Mediterranean and then sail to the Middle East, Africa, and all points beyond, making Sevastopol an immensely significant strategic asset to whatever country possesses it. In 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev made an unexpected and hugely consequential decision, one that's at the heart of the Russia-Ukraine conflict of recent years. Khrushchev, for reasons not entirely clear, transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was as if President Eisenhower in 1954 had ordered the transfer of Long Island from New York to the state of Connecticut. Though Crimea after this belonged to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, there were far more Russians than Ukrainians in the population. In 1954, there were about 3 times as many Russians as Ukrainians in Crimea. When Ukraine became an independent country in 1991, Crimea remained a part of this new nation of Ukraine. But in another momentous decision, the effects of which were also not foreseen at the time, after independence, Ukraine agreed in 1997 to grant the Russian Navy the right to use, alongside the Ukrainian Navy, the Soviet-era naval base at Sevastopol as the home port for the largest Russian warships. The Russian Navy and the Ukrainian Navy agreed to share the naval base at Sevastopol for 20 years, with this co-tenancy agreement scheduled to expire in 2017. Though it seems unthinkable to us now that Ukraine and Russia would have such cooperation, these decisions were made during the era of the reformer and Russian President Boris Yeltsin, where the spirit of the time remained one of friendly and peaceful coexistence. So much so that in 1994, in an agreement known as the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine surrendered all Soviet-era nuclear weapons on its territory. This is arguably the most significant development that made Putin's 2022 invasion possible. At the time of Ukraine's independence, Ukraine had the 3rd largest nuclear stockpile in the entire world, and the Ukrainians agreed to give up these weapons in exchange for vague promises from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom about Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States should never have allowed this to happen. But in fairness, Americans were worried that if there were nuclear weapons lying around in various countries, someone terrible may get their hands on them. But what haunts Ukraine today is that the text of the Budapest Memorandum did not include a specific guarantee of military assistance or mutual defense if Ukraine were ever invaded or attacked. Knowing this background, we can see the origin of the Rashomon diverging worldviews. Many Ukrainians celebrate their national independence in 1991 as finally being liberated from the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Soviets, and the Polish, all of whom had squelched their autonomy. This longing for nationhood explains why so many Ukrainians now fight so ferociously to repel Russia's invasion. They yearn to break the cycle of domination by their interfering neighbors. But in contrast, the Russians and those Ukrainians with affinity for Russia who constitute a significant minority in Ukraine view Ukraine and Crimea's independence and separation from Russia as a humiliating loss of the power and majesty that Russia enjoyed in the imperial and Soviet periods. For 70 years in the 20th century, the Soviet Union was an enormous multinational superpower feared by the West. But in 1991, that totally fell apart. Russia not only had to surrender its 14 other constituent Soviet socialist republics, but it also lost hegemony over Eastern European satellite countries that it had once dominated during the Cold War, namely Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. These sentiments of national shame and dishonor in Russia have only been exacerbated by the ever-expanding roster of NATO members, which now includes many of those formerly Russian-dominated countries. NATO was founded after World War II in 1949, and it stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a group of 30 member states who form a political and military alliance. Now, in the years since the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, the membership of NATO has increased impressively. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. During the Cold War, these three countries belonged to the Warsaw Treaty Organization, known as the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led military alliance of the USSR and its satellites in Eastern Europe that was also founded in 1949, but to oppose the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and their allies. In 2004, several more countries entered NATO: Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, and 3 Baltic states: Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. During the Cold War, again, all of these nations, except for Slovenia, had been within the Warsaw Pact. And in 2009, Albania was admitted too. Russia deeply objected and protested to all of these countries joining NATO, but in the 1990s and the early 2000s, Russia was too poor and frankly too weak to take any action to resist it. An inflection point occurred at NATO's annual summit in April of 2008, where it was announced that Ukraine and Georgia, both former Soviet socialist republics, would be next in line for NATO membership. A year before, at the 2007 Munich Security Conference, Putin had delivered a speech where he condemned and promised to challenge the United States' unipolar control of the post-Cold War world order. Putin argued in this speech that the United States was abusing their hegemonic power by exercising, quote, an almost uncontained hyper-use of force that is plunging the world into an abyss of permanent conflicts, end quote. Of course, he was referring to the American invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, these unwise and counterproductive invasions, coupled with the United States' already problematic foreign policy track record, gave Putin the opportunity to label the United States as hypocritical and tyrannical, declaring that it has, quote, greater and greater disdain for the basic principles of international law, end quote. Putin also declared in Munich that he viewed NATO's expansion to countries surrounding Russia's borders as, quote, a serious provocation that reduces our level of mutual trust, end quote. We have the right to ask, Putin said, against whom is this NATO expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances that our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations today? No one even remembers them, he said. Ukraine and Georgia were frightened by Putin's challenges to the United States and to NATO and sought protection from NATO, citing that the entire purpose of NATO is to protect countries' sovereignties. But Putin was also extremely threatened by the fact that Ukraine and Georgia had recently undergone separate color revolutions. In Georgia, a rose revolution in 2003, and in Ukraine, an orange revolution in 2004. And these were demonstrations that toppled corrupt pro-Russian governments and replaced them with more pro-Western, open, law-abiding ones. Putin seethed at these anti-Russian events in Ukraine and Georgia. And when the United States insisted in April of 2008 on rewarding the reformers in Ukraine and Georgia with the prize of NATO membership, especially after Putin made his views on NATO expansion clear at the Munich conference, that was Putin's breaking point. Both French President Nicolas Sarkozy and German Chancellor Angela Merkel warned President Bush that Ukraine and Georgia's entry into NATO would provoke Russia, and they were right. In August of 2008, just 4 months after the announcement that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become NATO members, Russia attacked and occupied the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. Russia continues to occupy these regions today, about 20% of the territory of Georgia, and Russia also continues to exercise vast influence over the country. The former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, is now indefinitely detained in a Russian-run Georgian prison where he has reportedly been tortured, poisoned, and may die. Tragically, the West did not react as strongly to Putin's invasion of Georgia as some argue that they should have. A European Union commission after the invasion, for instance, determined that Russia and Georgia were equally at fault. This gave Putin the impression that the West would not put up serious resistance to his territorial ambitions, and clearly he was right. Now on to Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014. In 2013, a year before, Ukraine's government was considering two competing economic proposals, one to become more economically integrated with Russia, and the other to become more so with the European Union. Although the Ukrainian parliament had overwhelmingly voted in favor of the European agreement, Ukraine's pro-Russia president Viktor Yanukovych rejected it and seemed prepared to sign an economic agreement with Russia. Huge demonstrations followed in Kiev, resulting in the Maidan Revolution, named after Maidan Square in Kiev, which ousted President Yanukovych and replaced him with a pro-Western, pro-American president, Petro Poroshenko. Russia viewed this as extremely provocative, and they feared that Ukrainian President Poroshenko would bring Ukraine into NATO. So in February of 2014, Putin invaded Crimea. Putin's soldiers, who were called the Little Green Men because of the color of their uniforms, seized Crimea in less than a month and declared it to be a part of Russia. The Obama administration's only response was to send helmets and combat food rations to Ukraine, likely hardly a concern to the Russian infiltrators who were able to easily meld with and mingle with the large Russian Russophone and Russophile population in Crimea, many of whom welcomed them. So why was Crimea then so important to Russia, and why did Russia act as it did when it did? The answer is to protect that naval base at Sebastopol on the Black Sea. When the Maidan Revolution prevailed in 2014, Russia lost its political influence over Ukraine. Russia did not want to risk that an independent, Western-oriented Ukrainian government in Kiev might jeopardize Russia's continued use of the deep-water naval base at Sevastopol. Again, an arrangement which Ukraine was scheduled to end in 2017. So immediately after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, Russia sent its military infiltrators into Crimea to take full control of that military base. Also in 2014, Putin began to incite and support pro-Russian separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine called the Donbas region. This region had once been part of the Russian Empire, and it was significantly populated by Ukrainians sympathetic to Russia. The Donbas consists of two provinces known as oblasts, Donetsk and Luhansk. Putin sent weapons, troops, and other assistance to support the secessionist insurrection against the government in Kiev, and this uprising continued for 8 years until Donetsk and Luhansk were fully occupied during Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. But beginning in 2014, Putin began to prepare the Donbas region for his 2022 invasion of all of Ukraine. In the years since 2014, the United States continued to promote the well-intentioned but risky policy of closer relations between Ukraine and the West, and of Ukraine joining NATO. President Donald Trump sent Javelin anti-tank missiles and other weapons to Ukraine, but otherwise tried not to provoke Russia directly about Ukraine. But in November of 2021, during President Biden's first year in office, Secretary of State Antony Blinken signed a strategic partnership agreement with Ukraine that it reasserted that the United States committed itself to admit Ukraine to NATO and also to reopen the sovereignty dispute about Crimea. Russia saw the strategic partnership agreement as threatening, and they started preparing for the Russian military for a possible invasion of Ukraine. Unexpected cover to do so arose when President Biden on January 19, 2022, made a major blunder where he said that a, quote, minor incursion by Russia might be acceptable to the United States.
Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, etc.
Only a few weeks after this gaffe, on February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. For some concluding thoughts, we see that Putin has maneuvered the United States and NATO into a precarious situation. If the United States and NATO take steps to establish deterrence against Russian aggression, then they are provoking Putin. The argument that the West started the war in Ukraine is expressed daily in Russian propaganda. For instance, the Victory Museum in Moscow, which is a museum that's dedicated to the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, is hosting a new exhibit called NATOism, which seeks to cast the Western military alliance as a threat as provocative, harmful, and existential as the Nazis in World War II. But if the US and NATO do not try to establish deterrence, then they may be providing Putin with a clear path to expansion. President Biden argued recently that Putin will, quote, never prevail in Ukraine, and we all hope that he's right. But here is the situation that we are in now, and I don't mean to depress you, but I also don't want to kid you. Number one, Putin is being aided heavily by Iran and China. Iran set up a drone factory in the Russian allied nation and former SSR of Tajikistan in May of 2022, and they also signed an agreement this past year to manufacture over 6,000 drones at a facility in Yelabuga, Russia. Chinese President Xi Jinping has also stepped up China's trade with Russia amid Western sanctions, and he is traveling to Moscow in the spring. Number two, U.S. and European sanctions on Russian oil have actually benefited Russia by putting Europe, which relies heavily on Russian oil, in a desperate situation, and it has strengthened the ruble by allowing Russia to charge more for their oil while China steps up its purchases of that oil. Number three, though the West has sent billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine, Western support for the war has already softened after just 1 year. In May of 2022, the Associated Press found that 60% of Americans were in favor of sending weapons to Ukraine. Now that is down 12%, standing at 48%. Additionally, we have to face that the U.S. foreign policy track record, whether it's Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, does indicate that Americans often demonstrate enthusiastic support in the beginning, but eventually get tired and bored and leave. Number four, relatedly, Russia is not going anywhere. Russia has a larger population than Ukraine, 143 million to 44 million, and a far larger economy, nearly 9 times greater than Ukraine by GDP in 2021. History tells us, whether it's the American Civil War, the Eastern Front, and the Pacific Theater in World War II, that the side with the larger population and the larger economy usually prevails in a war of attrition, which the Ukraine conflict has become. Number 5, Putin appears to have his sights set beyond Ukraine. Both American and Ukrainian intelligence have determined that Putin is apparently intending to use infiltrators to destabilize its neighbor Moldova, located between Russia and Ukraine, and remove its pro-Western president Maya Sandu, who won in a landslide in 2020. Moldova was intending to accept an invitation to join the European Union, but it seems that Russia does not want that to happen. And 6, finally, Russia has indicated its possible willingness to use nuclear weapons. Putin recently withdrew Russia from the New START treaty, the most recent nuclear weapons reduction deal with the United States. And additionally, a spat happened in January of 2023 between former CIA Director David Petraeus and Sevastopol's civic chamberhead Alexander Fomenchuk. The former CIA director said that it is, quote, an open question as to whether Ukraine can retake Crimea. And Sevastopol's civic chamberhead responded, quote, any attempt to seize Crimea and return it to Ukraine will immediately escalate into a thermonuclear global conflict. Russia will not forgive this, end quote. Given that Russia possesses more nuclear warheads than any country on Earth, including the United States, Americans should contemplate these words. The United States has a moral responsibility to help the Ukrainian people who have suffered evil, unspeakable brutality on behalf of Russia, and to resist Putin's further aggression. However, this is probably going to be a multi-year, multi-decade, and possibly multi-generation headache, bearing some resemblance to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Americans' failure to understand our adversaries and see the long-term vision of this war does not bode well for us or for Ukraine. Thanks for watching this Julie Noted, and be sure to check out my YouTube channel, Julie Hartman, and my talk show, Timeless with Julie Hartman. More Julie Noted clips coming soon.